The fluorescent lights of the grocery store buzzed overhead as I stood frozen in the cereal aisle, my shopping cart suddenly feeling like an anchor. 3 women from my neighborhood clustered near the organic section, their voices carrying just enough for me to catch fragments of their conversation. Can you imagine just walking away when your husband is fighting for his life? Poor man going through chemo treatments alone. That Murphy woman should be ashamed. My hands gripped the cart handles so tightly my knuckles went white. The box of cornflakes I'd been reaching for remained suspended in midair as the full weight of their words hit me. They were talking about me, about David, about a version of our story that was so twisted, so far from the truth, that I felt physically sick. What I'm about to tell you is absolutely true and will leave you speechless. Please like and subscribe. Tell me which city you call home, because this nightmare could happen to anyone, anywhere, and it started with the person I trusted most in the world. My name is Eleanor Murphy. I'm 55 years old, and until this moment in aisle 7, I thought I had successfully rebuilt my life after the most devastating period our family had ever faced. David's cancer diagnosis 3 years ago had turned our world upside down, but we had fought through it together. Every chemotherapy session, every sleepless night, every moment of fear and hope, I had been there. When the doctors said he needed round-the-clock care, I had taken leave from my job. When he lost his hair, I shaved mine off too. When he couldn't keep food down, I learned to make smoothies that wouldn't trigger his nausea. But apparently, that wasn't the story making its way through our community. I abandoned my shopping cart and walked quickly toward the exit, my mind racing. Where could this narrative be coming from? Who would tell such a vicious lie about the hardest time in our lives? The answer came to me as I sat in my car in the parking lot, hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. My daughter, Emma. 23-year-old Emma Murphy, who lived across town with her boyfriend and worked at the local bank. Emma, who had barely visited during her father's illness, claiming she couldn't handle seeing him so sick. Emma, who had screamed at me 6 months ago during David's recovery, accusing me of being too controlling, too protective, too involved in his care. "You're suffocating him, Mom," she had shouted during our last real conversation. "He's getting better, but you won't let him breathe." Those words had cut deep because there was a grain of truth in them. I had been protective. I had hovered. But abandonment? The accusation was so backwards, so cruel, that I felt my chest tighten with a familiar anxiety I hadn't experienced since David's worst days in treatment. When I got home, David was in his workshop behind our house, the sound of his saw cutting through pine boards, a comforting reminder that he was healthy and strong again. The workshop had become his sanctuary during recovery, and seeing him pursue his woodworking passion again had been one of my greatest joys. His thick brown hair had grown back, streaked with more silver than before, and his face had regained the fullness that chemotherapy had stolen. "David," I called as I approached the workshop. He looked up from his project, safety glasses perched on his nose, and smiled the same warm smile that had gotten me through our darkest days. "How was the store? You look like you've seen a ghost." David Murphy, my husband of 28 years, had always been able to read my emotions before I fully understood them myself. During his illness, this quality had been both a blessing and a burden. He always knew when I was more scared than I let on. I told him about the conversation I'd overheard, watching his face shift from confusion to anger to something deeper and more hurt. He set down his tools and pulled off his gloves, the casual movements somehow making the situation feel more real. "Emma's been saying what?" I don't know for certain it's her, I said, though we both knew it had to be. But David, people think I left you during your cancer treatment. They think I abandoned our family. The irony was devastating. I had given up everything to care for him. My job, my hobbies, my social life, my own doctor's appointments. I had slept on a cot in his hospital room for weeks. I had researched every treatment option, fought with insurance companies, and advocated for his care when he was too weak to speak for himself. "We need to call Sarah," David said quietly, referring to my best friend and colleague Sarah Chen, who had witnessed every moment of our struggle. Sarah and I had worked together at the accounting firm for over a decade, and she had been the one to help me navigate taking extended leave when David got sick. She had brought us meals, driven David to appointments when I was too exhausted, and held me while I cried in the hospital cafeteria. Sarah lived just 2 streets over, and she had become like family to us over the years. She had also been the one to gently suggest that I might need to step back slightly as David recovered, not because I was doing anything wrong, but because my intense caregiving had become a habit that was hard to break, even as he regained his independence. As David called Sarah, I sank into one of his workshop chairs and tried to process how my greatest act of love had been twisted into its opposite. Somewhere out there, people who had known our family for years believed I was the kind of woman who would abandon her sick husband. The betrayal felt suffocating, and that's when the pattern snapped into place. Sarah arrived within 20 minutes, her silver Honda pulling into our driveway with the urgency of someone who understood that some conversations couldn't wait. Through the kitchen window, I watched her hurry up the walkway, her expression already set in the determined look she wore when tackling difficult problems. David had moved us inside from the workshop, and now we sat around our kitchen table like we were planning battle strategy. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden surface where we'd shared so many family meals over the years. "Tell me exactly what you heard," Sarah said without preamble, settling into the chair across from me. Her dark hair was pulled back in its usual practical ponytail, and she wore the same no-nonsense expression that had gotten us both through countless workplace crises. I repeated the conversation from the grocery store, watching Sarah's face grow increasingly troubled. She had been there through every moment of David's illness, had seen me transform from a working mother into a full-time caregiver overnight. "This is insane," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You practically lived at that hospital. You turned down the promotion to stay home with David. You haven't been apart from him for more than a few hours since his diagnosis." David reached across the table and took my hand. His fingers were stronger now than they'd been in months, but I could feel the slight tremor that remained from the chemotherapy. "We need to talk to Emma directly. Tonight." The thought made my stomach clench. Emma had been distant since starting her junior year of high school, but I'd attributed it to normal teenage behavior and the stress of watching her father fight cancer. Now I wondered how long she'd been harboring this resentment. How many conversations with friends had solidified this twisted narrative in her mind. "What if she really believes it?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since I'd left the store. What if somehow, in trying to take care of everyone, I made her feel abandoned? Sarah leaned forward, her expression softening. "Listen to me. I watched you give up everything for your family. Everything. You missed your own mother's birthday party because David had a treatment that day. You slept on that horrible hospital chair for 6 weeks straight. You researched clinical trials until 3 a.m. and called doctors across the country looking for better options. But maybe Emma needed something different from me," I said, the words tasting bitter. Maybe she needed a mother who could still function normally, who could attend her school events and help with homework, and listen to teenage problems instead of being consumed with medication schedules and insurance claims. David squeezed my hand tighter. Emma went to every single one of her school events this year. You were there for all of them. Was I really there, though? Or was I just physically present while my mind was somewhere else, worrying about your next scan results or whether we could afford the new medication? The kitchen fell silent except for the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Emma's music drifting down from her bedroom upstairs. She'd been home for an hour, had called out a brief hello before disappearing to her room, as had become her habit. Sarah stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the backyard where Emma used to play on the swing set David had built when she was 7. You know what I think happened? I think Emma got scared. Really, really scared that she might lose her father. And sometimes when kids get that frightened, they look for someone to blame. Someone safe to be angry with. But why me? The question came out smaller than I intended. Because you're the one she trusts not to leave, Sarah said, turning back to face us. She knows you'll love her no matter what she says or does. David was fragile, untouchable in a way. But you were her constant, so you became the safe target for all that fear and anger. David nodded slowly. It makes sense. During the worst of it, Emma barely spoke to me. She'd sit by my bed, but she wouldn't really engage. Like she was afraid to get too close. And now that you're better, she might be looking back at that time and rewriting it to make sense of how powerless she felt, Sarah added. It's easier to believe her mother wasn't there than to admit how terrifying it was to almost lose her father. The sound of Emma's bedroom door opening made us all freeze. Her footsteps on the stairs were heavier than usual, and when she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face was flushed with the particular combination of defiance and vulnerability that I recognized from years of parenting. I heard you talking, Emma said, crossing her arms over her chest. I know what this is about. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken as Emma stood in the doorway, her chin raised in that familiar gesture of defensive courage I'd seen so many times over the years. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I felt David's hand tighten around mine under the table. Emma, I started, but she held up her hand. No, let me talk first. Her voice wavered slightly despite her determined posture. I know Sarah told you what I said to my friends, and I know you're all sitting here trying to figure out what's wrong with me. Sarah shifted in her chair, her expression gentle but alert. We're not trying to figure out what's wrong with you, honey. We're trying to understand how you're feeling. How I'm feeling? Emma's laugh came out sharp and brittle. I'm feeling like everyone thinks I'm some kind of liar now. Like I made up this whole story for attention or something. David cleared his throat softly. Emma, can you sit down with us, please? For a moment, I thought she might refuse. Her eyes darted between the three of us, and I could see the war playing out on her face between the urge to run back upstairs and the deeper need to finally have this conversation. Slowly, reluctantly, she pulled out the remaining chair and sat down, but kept her arms crossed protectively over her chest. The thing is, Emma said, staring at the table instead of looking at any of us, what I said to my friends wasn't exactly a lie. My stomach dropped. Emma, what do you mean? She finally looked up, and I was startled to see tears gathering in her eyes. You were here, Mom? Physically, I mean. But you weren't really here. Not for me. The words hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to protest, but Emma continued before I could speak. Do you remember when I had that presentation for history class? The one about World War II? I worked on it for weeks, and I was so nervous because it was worth half my grade. I frowned, trying to recall. The months of David's treatment felt like a blur of hospital visits and sleepless nights. I remember you working on something about the war. I came downstairs that morning to practice it one more time before school. You were sitting right where you are now, and I asked if you wanted to hear it. Do you remember what you said? The kitchen felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. I could see from David's expression that he was trying to remember too, but those months were hazy for all of us. You said, "That sounds great, honey. Just give me 5 minutes." But you were on the phone with the insurance company, trying to get them to cover Dad's new medication. And then, after that call, there was another one with the hospital about scheduling his next round of tests. Sarah leaned forward slightly. What happened with the presentation, Emma? I sat at the bottom of the stairs for an hour, waiting for those 5 minutes. I kept hearing Mom's voice getting more and more frustrated with whoever she was talking to. Finally, I had to leave for school. Emma's voice grew smaller. I never got to practice it. I completely bombed the presentation because I was so nervous. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. I remembered the insurance battle that morning, how they'd initially denied coverage for a medication that David's oncologist insisted was crucial. I'd spent hours on the phone, fighting with representatives, getting transferred from department to department. Emma, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot. That's just it, Mom. You forgot a lot of things that year. And I get why. I really do. Dad was sick, and that was the most important thing. But it felt like I disappeared. David reached across the table toward Emma, but she pulled her hands back into her lap. Sweetheart, your mom was trying to save my life. I know that. The words burst out of Emma with more force than I'd heard from her in months. I know she was fighting for you, and I know it was life or death, and I know I'm selfish for even being upset about it. But knowing something and feeling something are different, aren't they? Sarah nodded slowly. They absolutely are. Emma, what you're feeling isn't selfish. You were 15 years old, watching your father battle cancer, and you needed your mother too. But I couldn't need her, Emma said, and now the tears were falling freely. How could I compete with cancer? How could I tell my mom that I needed help with homework when she was trying to keep my dad alive? So I handled everything myself. School, friends, everything. I felt like I couldn't breathe properly. Emma, you could have told me. You should have told me. When? The question came out like a challenge. When you were at the hospital with Dad? When you were on the phone with doctors? When you were crying in the bathroom thinking I couldn't hear you? The accuracy of her observations was devastating. I had cried in the bathroom, thinking I was hiding my fear from her. I had been on the phone constantly. I had spent countless hours at the hospital. So, when my friends were complaining about their parents, and Jessica said her mom was being super strict about curfew, and Maya was annoyed that her dad kept asking about her grades, Emma shrugged helplessly. I said my mom had basically checked out when my dad got sick, and it felt true when I said it. David was quiet for a long moment, then said, Emma, look at me. Reluctantly, she met his eyes. Your mother didn't abandon us, but I think maybe we both abandoned you a little bit, didn't we? Emma's face crumpled, and she nodded. I was so focused on surviving, on fighting, that I didn't think about what this was doing to you. And your mom was so focused on taking care of me that she didn't have anything left over. But that's not fair to either of you, Emma said through her tears. You were sick. Mom was scared. I should have been more understanding. Sarah shook her head. Emma, You were a kid dealing with an impossible situation. You don't have to be understanding about everything. I stood up slowly and moved around the table toward Emma, half expecting her to pull away. Instead, she looked up at me with eyes so full of pain that it took my breath away. Emma, I need you to know something. What you told your friends. You weren't lying. I did abandon you in a way, even though I never meant to. And I am so sorry. Mom? No, let me finish. You're right that I was physically here, but not emotionally available. You're right that I forgot important things. You're right that you had to handle too much on your own. I knelt down beside her chair. And you're also right that it wasn't fair to you, even though your dad was sick. Emma looked at me with surprise. I thought you were going to tell me I was wrong. How can I tell you that your feelings are wrong? You lived through that year too. Your experience of it is just as valid as mine. David cleared his throat. Emma, can I ask you something? When you told your friends that story, how did it feel? She considered this. At first it felt good, I guess, like I was finally telling someone how lonely I was. But then, she trailed off. Then what? Sarah prompted gently. Then it started feeling wrong, because even though you weren't available the way I needed, Mom, I could see how hard you were trying. I could see how scared you were. And reducing all of that to, my mom abandoned us, felt mean. I reached out tentatively and touched Emma's hand. This time, she didn't pull away. What if we're both right? I suggested. What if I was fighting as hard as I could for our family, and I also let you down when you needed me most? Emma stared at our joined hands. Can both things be true? I think they have to be, David said. Life isn't usually as simple as someone being completely right or completely wrong. Sarah smiled sadly. That's one of the hardest things about growing up, isn't it? Learning that people can love you and still hurt you, sometimes at the same time. Emma nodded, then looked directly at me. Mom, I need to tell you something else. Something I never said during Dad's treatment, because I felt so guilty about thinking it. My heart rate picked up again. What is it, sweetheart? I was angry at you. Not just sad or lonely, but really, really angry. And I still am sometimes. The honesty of it hit me harder than I expected, but there was also something relieving about it. Tell me about the anger, Emma. I kept thinking that if it was me who was sick, you would have found a way to still take care of Dad too. Like, you would have managed to be everything to everyone because that's what moms do. So why couldn't you manage to still be my mom while you were taking care of Dad? David inhaled sharply. Emma, that's not fair. No, David, let her talk. Sarah interrupted. Emma, that sounds like a really painful thought to carry around. It was, because I knew it wasn't logical, but I couldn't stop thinking it. And then I felt horrible for thinking it, which made me even angrier. I squeezed Emma's hand. I'm glad you're telling me this, even if it's hard to hear. Are you mad at me for feeling this way? The question broke my heart. Oh, Emma, no, I'm not mad. I'm sad that you've been carrying this alone for so long. But what if I can't stop being angry? What if part of me is always going to resent that year? Before I could answer, the front door opened and closed with a bang that made us all jump. We looked at each other in confusion until we heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. That's impossible, David said quietly. She's not supposed to be back until next week. But then a voice called out from the living room, a voice that made Emma's face go completely white. Hello? Anyone home? I know I'm early, but I have some news that couldn't wait. Emma's grip on my hand suddenly tightened painfully. Mom, I can't. Not right now. Not when we're finally talking about everything. It's okay, I whispered, but my own stomach had dropped to somewhere around my feet. The timing couldn't have been worse. David was already standing up, running his hands through his hair. I'll go talk to her. Tell her we need a few more minutes. No, Emma said firmly, surprising all of us. She'll want to know why, and then she'll feel bad for interrupting, and then we'll all spend the next hour managing her feelings instead of finishing this conversation. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's actually pretty insightful, Emma. We could hear movement in the living room, the sound of bags being set down, keys being placed on the counter. Any moment now, she'd come looking for us. What kind of news do you think she has? I asked David quietly. With her, it could be anything from a new job to a new hair color, he replied, but there was tension in his voice that suggested he was thinking the same thing I was. Her timing had always been spectacularly inconvenient. Emma took a shaky breath. Can we just tell her we were having a family meeting? That's not technically a lie. We don't have to tell her anything specific right now if you're not ready, I said. But Emma, she's going to notice that you've been crying. And that we all look like we've been having some kind of intense conversation, Sarah added. Your face gets really red when you're emotional, just like your mom's does. Emma touched her cheeks self-consciously. Great. So much for keeping this private until I figure out what I want to say. The footsteps were getting closer to the kitchen. We had maybe 30 seconds before she found us. Emma, I said quickly, I need you to know that what you said about being angry, about carrying that resentment, that's completely normal, and we don't have to solve everything today. But what if she asks about why I've been saying those things to my friends? What if she already knows? David and I exchanged glances. It was entirely possible. Emma's friends and her friends all moved in overlapping social circles, especially at school events. One thing at a time, Sarah said calmly. We deal with right now first. The kitchen door swung open just as Emma was wiping her eyes with her sleeve. There you all are. I've been calling hello for 5 minutes. She stopped short when she saw all of our faces. Oh, what's going on? Did someone die? The question was so typically dramatic and immediate that despite everything, I almost smiled. No, nobody died. We were just having a conversation. She looked around the table, taking in Emma's red eyes, David's uncomfortable posture, Sarah's presence during what was clearly a family moment. What kind of conversation requires this level of emotional devastation? Emma let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It's not devastation. It's just hard. Hard how? She moved closer to the table, her concern genuine despite her dramatic phrasing. Emma, sweetheart, you look like you've been crying for hours. Not hours, Emma mumbled. Just like 30 minutes. I could see her working up to asking more direct questions, the way she always did when she sensed family drama. The problem was, once she started asking questions, she didn't stop until she had the whole story. Should I leave? Sarah asked quietly. This might be a family-only conversation now. No, Emma said quickly. Please stay. You're helping. She raised an eyebrow at this. Helping with what exactly? David cleared his throat. We were talking about some things that happened during Dad's treatment, some difficult things that we never really addressed as a family. What kind of difficult things? The directness of the question hung in the air. Emma looked at me, then at David, then back at me. I could see her trying to decide how much she was ready to reveal. Things about how we all handled that time differently? I said carefully. about how some of us felt abandoned or unsupported. Her eyes sharpened immediately. Abandoned by who? Emma's breathing became more shallow. I realized we were about to have a very different conversation than the one we'd been building toward. What's your news? David asked quickly, trying to redirect. You said you had something that couldn't wait. But she was focused now, and I knew that look. No, let's talk about this abandonment thing first. Emma, who made you feel abandoned? Emma looked at me with something close to panic in her eyes. Because, she continued, settling into the chair Sarah had vacated, if someone in this family made my granddaughter feel abandoned during one of the hardest times in our lives, I think that's something we need to address immediately. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Emma looked trapped between her grandmother's direct question and her own fear of the truth. I watched my daughter's face cycle through panic, determination, and then something that looked like resignation. It's complicated, Emma said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Complicated how? Margaret pressed, leaning forward. Emma, sweetheart, you know you can tell me anything. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't how I'd wanted this conversation to go. We'd been making progress, but now with Margaret's protective instincts fully activated, everything felt more volatile. Maybe we should take a break, David suggested, clearly sensing the shift in energy. Let everyone process what we've already talked about. But Margaret wasn't having it. No, I think we need to address this right now. If someone hurt my granddaughter during that horrible time, I want to know about it. She turned to me. You said some of us felt abandoned. Who felt abandoned and who did the abandoning? Emma's eyes filled with tears again. Grandma, please don't make this harder than it already is. I'm not trying to make anything hard. I'm trying to understand why you're sitting here crying about feeling abandoned when we all went through Dad's cancer together as a family. The irony of Margaret's words wasn't lost on me. Here she was, demanding answers about abandonment, when she'd missed the entire first part of our conversation because she'd been out doing whatever she'd been doing. Where were you today, anyway? Emma asked suddenly, and I could hear the edge in her voice. You said you had news that couldn't wait, but you weren't here when we needed to talk about this stuff. Margaret looked taken aback. I was at my book club, and then I had some errands. What does that have to do with anything? It doesn't, Emma said quickly, but I could see the parallel she was drawing. It's just, never mind. Sarah cleared her throat gently. Maybe I should explain what we've been discussing, since I've been here for most of it. I felt grateful for Sarah's intervention, but also nervous about how she'd frame everything. We've been talking about how different family members experienced David's illness and treatment, Sarah said carefully. Emma has been carrying some difficult feelings about that time, and she's been trying to work through them. What kind of difficult feelings? Margaret asked, but her tone was softer now, more concerned than accusatory. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I felt like Mom left us when Dad got sick. Like she just checked out emotionally and left Dad and me to deal with everything alone. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Margaret's face went through several expressions before settling on something I couldn't quite read. Left you how? She asked quietly. She worked all the time. She was never home. When she was home, she was tired or stressed or just not really there. Dad was the one who explained everything to me, who helped me with homework, who made sure I was okay. Mom just disappeared into her job and left us. Margaret looked at me, then back at Emma. And you've been carrying this feeling all this time? I've been telling people that's what happened, Emma said, her voice getting smaller. I told my friends. I told my teachers. I've been saying Mom abandoned us when Dad got cancer. The look on Margaret's face shifted to something closer to shock. Oh, Emma. I know it sounds terrible, Emma continued, the words coming faster now. And I know Mom was working to pay for Dad's treatment and keep us afloat financially. But it felt like abandonment. It felt like when things got really hard, she just left Dad and me to deal with it by ourselves. David reached across the table and took Emma's hand. That's not entirely fair, Em. Mom was doing what she thought was best for all of us. But it didn't feel like that, Emma said, looking at him. Did it feel like that to you? David was quiet for a long moment. No, he admitted. It felt lonely sometimes. Like we were all dealing with my cancer separately, instead of together. Margaret sat back in her chair, processing this information. I could see her trying to reconcile what she'd observed during that time with what Emma and David were telling her. I had no idea you felt this way, she said finally, looking at me. You seemed so strong, so capable of handling everything. I was trying to handle everything, I said. I was trying to keep us financially stable and make sure David got the best care possible and protect Emma from as much of the scary stuff as I could. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were doing what you thought was right? Sarah said gently. That doesn't mean it was easy for anyone. Margaret nodded slowly. This is a lot to take in. Emma, honey, I wish you'd talk to someone in the family about feeling this way, instead of telling people outside the family that your mother abandoned you. I tried to talk about it, but everyone kept saying how hard Mom was working and how much she was sacrificing. Nobody wanted to hear that I felt left behind. I would have listened, Margaret said firmly. I would have helped you work through those feelings. You were dealing with your own stuff, Emma replied. You were scared about Dad too, and you were trying to help Mom by taking care of some of the house stuff and cooking. Everyone was doing their jobs except nobody's job was making sure I was emotionally okay. The truth of this statement settled over all of us. Margaret looked stricken. That's not entirely true, David said quietly. I was trying to make sure you were okay. You were fighting cancer, Emma said, turning to him. You shouldn't have had to take care of me. That should have been Mom and Grandma's job, but Mom was never around, and Grandma was trying to take care of everyone else. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Oh, sweetheart, we failed you, didn't we? I don't know if it's about failure, Sarah interjected. It sounds like everyone was trying their best in an impossible situation, but Emma's feelings are valid and they need to be addressed. The problem is, Emma said, looking around the table, I've been telling this story for 2 years now. About Mom abandoning us, and I don't know how to take that back, or even if I want to. Margaret leaned forward. What do you mean? You don't know if you want to? Emma's face flushed. I mean, part of me is still angry. Part of me still thinks Mom chose work over family when we needed her most, and part of me thinks she owes me an apology before I stop telling people what really happened. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Margaret looked at me expectantly, but before I could respond, the front door opened and closed with a bang, and Margaret jumped up. Oh no, she said, looking panicked. I completely forgot. I invited someone over to discuss my news. They're here. Actually, let me just text them that something came up, Margaret said, already reaching for her phone. This conversation is too important to interrupt. No, wait, I said, surprising myself. Maybe we should take a break anyway. This is a lot for all of us to process. Emma looked relieved, and David nodded slowly. That might be good. We've covered a lot of ground here. Margaret hesitated, her finger hovering over her phone screen. Are you sure? I can reschedule. Go ahead, Sarah said. Sometimes stepping away from a difficult conversation and coming back to it helps everyone think more clearly. Margaret sent her text and sat back down. Within minutes, we heard the door again and muffled voices from the front hallway. Margaret excused herself, and we could hear her explaining that she needed to reschedule, her voice apologetic but firm. When she returned, she looked drained. They understood. We can meet next week instead. What was the meeting about? David asked. You mentioned news earlier. Margaret glanced around the table. It feels strange to bring it up now, with everything else going on. Maybe it would be good to talk about something else for a few minutes, Emma said quietly. I think I need a break from talking about cancer and feelings and all of that. I felt a stab of hurt at her dismissive tone, but Sarah caught my eye and shook her head slightly, reminding me to let it go for now. Well, Margaret began, settling back into her chair. I've been thinking about making some changes. Big changes, actually. I've been looking into selling the house. The silence that followed was profound. David was the first to speak. Selling this house? Mom, you've lived here for 30 years? 32 years, Margaret corrected. Since before your father died, and that's exactly why I think it's time. This place is too big for me, too expensive to maintain, and honestly, too full of memories that sometimes feel overwhelming. Emma looked startled. But this is where we have Christmas, where we had all those Sunday dinners when I was little. This is home. Home isn't going anywhere, sweetheart, Margaret said gently. But I need something smaller, something more manageable. I've been looking at some lovely condos closer to downtown. I found myself thinking about what this would mean practically. Have you talked to a realtor yet? Do you know what the house might be worth? I've done some preliminary research, Margaret said. The market is good right now, and this neighborhood has become quite desirable. I could probably get enough to buy something smaller outright and have money left over for retirement. David shifted in his chair, and I could see he was processing this news alongside everything else we'd discussed. Is this about money? Because if you need help with expenses, we could figure something out. It's not about needing help, Margaret said firmly. It's about wanting independence and simplicity. I spend my weekends doing yard work I don't enjoy and maintaining rooms I barely use. I want to travel more, maybe take some classes, volunteer somewhere meaningful. This house ties me down. Sarah leaned forward with interest. What kind of place are you thinking about? There's a development about 15 minutes from here. 2-bedroom condos with a community garden and a fitness center. No yard work, no roof repairs, no furnace maintenance. Just living. Emma's expression had shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like panic. But where would we go for holidays? Where would we have family dinners? We'd figure it out, Margaret said. Maybe we'd start having Christmas at David and Rebecca's house. Or yours, when you're older and settled somewhere. I don't want things to change more than they already have, Emma said, her voice rising slightly. Everything's been different since Dad got sick, and now you want to change this too? The emotional charge in the room shifted back toward the difficult territory we'd been navigating earlier. I realized that for Emma, the house represented stability in a period when she'd felt like everything else was falling apart. Change isn't always bad, Em, David said gently. Sometimes it's necessary for people to grow and move forward. Easy for you to say, Emma replied. You got through cancer and now your life is getting back to normal. Grandma gets a new house and a new life. Mom has her career figured out. What do I get? Everything I counted on keeps disappearing. The raw honesty in her voice hit all of us. Margaret reached across the table toward Emma's hand. Oh, honey, I didn't think about how this would feel to you. Nobody thinks about how things feel to me, Emma said, pulling her hand away. That's been the whole problem. Sarah cleared her throat softly. Emma, I hear that you're feeling like a lot of changes have happened without considering your feelings. But I'm wondering if some of your reaction might be about feeling like you don't have control over anything in your life right now. Emma looked at Sarah with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. What do you mean? Well, you were a teenager when your dad got sick. You couldn't control that. You couldn't control your mom's work schedule or your family's financial situation. You couldn't control your dad's treatment or recovery. And now, you can't control your grandmother's decision about her house. That's a lot of powerlessness for someone your age. So, what am I supposed to do about it? Maybe we start by figuring out what you can control, Sarah said, and what choices you do have, even in situations that feel completely out of your hands. Margaret nodded slowly. You know what? The house decision doesn't have to be made immediately. Maybe we should all think about this more, together. I don't want you to not sell your house because of me, Emma said quickly. That's not fair either. It's not about fairness, Margaret replied. It's about making sure we're all ready for the changes we make and that we make them thoughtfully. David had been quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke up. I think we're dancing around something important here. Emma, you've been carrying around anger about feeling abandoned and unheard for 2 years. Mom's been carrying around worry about you and guilt about her choices. Grandma's been trying to take care of everyone, and I've been trying to recover and get back to normal. He paused, looking around the table. But maybe we can't get back to normal. Maybe we need to figure out what our new normal looks like, together. What do you mean? I asked. I mean, maybe we need to talk about how we want to be a family going forward, what we need from each other, what we can realistically give, how we want to handle big decisions and support each other through changes. Emma stared at him. You want to have family meetings or something? Maybe, David said with a slight smile. Would that be so terrible? Before Emma could answer, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and frowned. That's odd. My friend is asking if we can still meet today after all. She says it's urgent and can't wait until next week. She looked around the table apologetically. I know our timing is terrible, but she seems really upset about something. Emma looked at Margaret's phone with suspicion. What kind of urgent thing can't wait when we're in the middle of talking about our family falling apart? Emma, I said gently, but she had a point. The timing did seem strange. Margaret set her phone down and looked conflicted. You're right. This conversation is more important. I'll text her back and say we need to reschedule. No, don't do that because of me, Emma said, though her tone suggested she appreciated the gesture. But can I ask what's so urgent that she's changing plans at the last minute? Margaret glanced at her phone again. She says she needs to talk about a major life decision and doesn't have anyone else to discuss it with. But honestly, after everything we've been talking about today, I'm realizing that maybe I do the same thing she's doing. What do you mean? David asked. I drop everything when people need me, even when it's not the best timing. And maybe that's part of what happened during your treatment, Emma. I kept trying to be available for everyone else's needs without really checking in about what our family needed. I felt a knot in my stomach. Are you saying I was one of the people making demands on your time? Not demands, Margaret said carefully. But I felt like I needed to be strong for you, to not add to your stress by saying I was overwhelmed too. So when you needed to vent about work, or worry about David, or figure out Emma's school situation, I just listened and tried to help. Emma leaned forward. But that's what friends do, right? They help each other? Yes, but good friends also pay attention to whether their friend is drowning, Margaret replied. And I think I was drowning for a while there, but I didn't tell anyone because everyone else seemed to be struggling more than I was. David set down his coffee cup. So you were taking care of Emma and me. Mom was working constantly and worrying about everything, and Grandma was trying to take care of all of us while dealing with her own stuff. No wonder everyone felt abandoned in some way. I didn't feel abandoned, Margaret protested. Didn't you, though? I asked quietly. When was the last time someone asked how you were doing and really wanted to hear the answer? Not just, how are you in passing, but really wanted to know? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I can't remember. Emma looked uncomfortable. I never asked you that. I just assumed you were fine because you always seem to have everything together. That's the thing about trying to be the person everyone can count on, Margaret said. People stop thinking you need anything. Her phone buzzed again with another text. She glanced at it and sighed. What does it say? I asked. She's asking if she can come over here instead of meeting at the coffee shop. Says she doesn't want to be in public when she talks about this. David raised an eyebrow. What do you want to do, Grandma? Margaret looked around the table at all of us. Honestly, I want to tell her that today isn't good for me, that I'm having an important conversation with my family, and I need to focus on that. But I feel guilty even thinking it. Why? Emma asked. Because what if she really needs me? What if something terrible has happened, and I'm being selfish by putting our family meeting first? Or, I said carefully, what if you're allowed to have boundaries about your time and energy? What if being a good friend doesn't mean being available every single time someone needs you? But what if I had done that when you needed me during David's treatment? Margaret asked. What if I had said I couldn't help? Then we would have figured something else out, I said. And maybe we would have been more honest about what we were all going through instead of trying to protect each other from our feelings. Emma picked up Margaret's phone without asking. What are you doing? Margaret asked quickly. I'm going to text her back for you, Emma said. I'm going to tell her that you're dealing with a family situation today, and you'll call her tomorrow to reschedule. Emma, you can't just... Why not? You said yourself that you don't want to drop everything right now, and we're not done talking. I finally feel like we're actually talking about real stuff instead of just pretending everything's fine. David nodded. She's right. This feels like the first honest conversation we've had in months. Margaret looked torn. But what if... What if what? I interrupted. What if she gets mad? What if she finds someone else to talk to? What if she realizes you're not always available? Maybe those things would be okay? Emma was already typing on Margaret's phone. I'm telling her you're sorry, but today won't work, and that you hope she understands. Don't send that yet, Margaret said, reaching for the phone. But then she stopped. Actually, wait. Let me think about this. She sat back in her chair, staring at the phone in Emma's hands. You know what the scariest part is? Part of me is relieved at the idea of saying no, and that makes me feel like a terrible friend. Or like a human being with limits, David suggested. When did I stop thinking I was allowed to have limits? Margaret wondered aloud. Probably around the same time I decided I had to handle everything by myself, I said. And around the same time Emma decided she couldn't ask for what she needed. Emma looked up from the phone. Should I send this text or not? Because she just sent another one asking what time she should come over. Margaret took a deep breath. Send it, but add that I'll call her tonight to check in and see if there's anything urgent that can't wait until tomorrow." Emma finished typing and hit send before anyone could change their mind. "There," she said, setting the phone down. "How does it feel to have boundaries?" "Terrifying," Margaret admitted, "and kind of good." The phone immediately buzzed with a response. Everyone looked at it, but no one picked it up. "Aren't you going to check what she said?" David asked. Margaret shook her head. "Not right now. Right now, I want to finish talking about us." Just then, I realized something that made my heart sink. "Emma, when you were talking about me abandoning the family, how much of that was about me not being emotionally available, even when I was physically there?" Emma's face changed. "What do you mean?" "I mean, during your dad's treatment and after, was I so focused on managing everything and keeping us all moving forward that I stopped really seeing you? Stopped asking what you needed instead of just assuming I knew?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the room. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away from me. "You want me to be honest? Really honest?" I nodded, even though every part of me was bracing for impact. "You were there, but you weren't there," she said quietly. "Like, you'd ask how I was doing, but you were already moving on to the next thing before I could answer. You'd make dinner, and we'd all sit together, but you'd be making lists in your head. I could see it on your face." David reached over and squeezed my hand. "She's not wrong. You went into crisis management mode, and you never really came out of it." "I was trying to keep everything together," I said, feeling defensive despite myself. "I was trying to take care of everyone." "But who was taking care of you?" Margaret asked. "And who was Emma supposed to talk to when she was scared?" Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I tried to talk to you a few times. Remember when I asked if Dad was going to die, and you said, 'We're not going to think about that right now'? And when I said I was having nightmares, you bought me some chamomile tea and told me to think positive thoughts?" The memory hit me like a punch to the stomach. I had said those things. I had thought I was being strong, being the rock everyone needed. Instead, I had been shutting down the conversations Emma needed most. "Oh, honey," I whispered. "I thought I was protecting you." "I didn't need protection," Emma said. "I needed my mom, the real one, who used to let me crawl into bed with you guys when I was scared, who used to sit with me until I fell asleep when I was upset. Instead, I got this efficient version who had everything under control, but no time for feelings." David squeezed my hand tighter. "You know what's funny? I was so focused on getting through treatment that I didn't even realize how much you had changed until after. It was like you forgot how to just be with us instead of doing for us. And then, after Dad got better, when I tried to talk about how scared I'd been, you'd say things like, 'Well, that's all behind us now,' or 'Let's focus on moving forward,'" Emma continued. "It felt like you'd rather pretend that whole year didn't happen." Margaret was listening intently. "That's what you meant about abandonment. Not that she wasn't physically there, but that she wasn't emotionally available when you needed her most." "Exactly," Emma said. "And I know she was dealing with her own stuff, but I was just a kid. I didn't understand why my mom suddenly couldn't handle talking about anything real. I felt like I was seeing myself from the outside for the first time. I was so terrified that if I let myself really feel everything, I'd fall apart completely. And I thought if I fell apart, everyone else would too." "But you did fall apart anyway," David said gently. "Just in a different way. You fell apart by becoming someone none of us could really reach. And I guess I told people you abandoned us because that's what it felt like. Emma said. Not physically, but emotionally. Like the mom I knew before Dad got sick just disappeared, and this new person took her place. The room felt heavy with years of unspoken hurt and misunderstanding. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the teenager who'd been acting out, but the scared kid who'd lost both her dad's health and her mom's emotional presence in one devastating year. Emma, I am so sorry, I said. I thought I was being strong for you, but I was actually abandoning you when you needed me most. The weird thing is, Emma said, I think I've been doing the same thing lately. Like, instead of telling you I was still struggling with stuff from that time, I just got angry and started pushing everyone away. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. And I've been so busy fixing everyone else's problems that I haven't dealt with my own fear of disappointing people or being alone. David looked around at all of us. We're all pretty good at avoiding the hard conversations, aren't we? Well, we're having one now, I pointed out. Yeah, but how did we get here? Emma asked. By me completely melting down and saying awful things about you to my friends. By you finding out and being so hurt that you couldn't hide it anymore. We shouldn't have to wait for everything to explode before we talk about real stuff. Margaret's phone buzzed again with another text, but she didn't even glance at it. You're right, I said to Emma. We should be able to talk about hard things before they become crisis things. But I don't know how to do that. I've gotten so used to managing and fixing and moving forward that I've forgotten how to just sit with difficult feelings. Maybe we could practice? David suggested. Like, what if we had regular check-ins where we actually said how we were doing, not just fine or okay? Emma looked skeptical. You think that would actually work? We've been doing fine for so long. I don't know, I admitted, but I'm willing to try something different because what we've been doing clearly isn't working. Margaret's phone buzzed a third time, and this time Emma picked it up. She's getting pretty insistent, Emma said, reading the screen. She wants to know if everything's okay and if you're mad at her. Margaret looked at the phone, then at all of us. You know what? This is exactly what we're talking about. She's making me feel guilty for having one afternoon that isn't about her problems, and I'm about to cave and text her back apologizing. But you're not going to? David asked. Margaret stared at the phone for a long moment. I'm not going to. Because if I can't have one difficult conversation with my own family without dropping everything for her drama, then I'm part of the problem. Just then, Emma's own phone started ringing. Emma looked down at her buzzing phone, the screen lighting up her face in the dim living room. The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the coffee table, where our untouched mugs of tea had grown cold during our conversation. It's Jessica, Emma said, her thumb hovering over the screen. She's probably wondering where I disappeared to after my whole meltdown earlier. I watched my daughter's face, seeing the same conflict there that had just played out with Margaret's phone. The pull between this moment of real connection and the outside demands that always seemed to intrude. What do you want to do? I asked, genuinely curious rather than directing. Emma stared at the phone as it stopped ringing, then immediately started again. I want to ignore it, she said slowly. But I also feel guilty. Like, what if she really needs something? What did you need when you were telling her those things about me? I asked. The question came out before I could second guess it, but I realized I genuinely wanted to know. Emma's shoulders sagged. I needed someone to be angry with me, like to match how angry I was feeling inside. She looked up at me. And I needed someone to tell me that my feelings made sense, even if they weren't fair. David shifted forward in his chair. Did it help, having someone agree with you? For like 5 minutes, Emma admitted. But then I just felt worse because I knew I was being unfair to Mom, and now Jessica thinks terrible things about her, and I don't know how to fix that without making myself look like a liar. The phone buzzed with a text this time. Emma glanced at it and winced. She's asking if I'm okay and if I want her to come over, Emma said. She says she's worried about me being home with you, Mom, after everything I told her. I felt that familiar stab of hurt, but this time it was accompanied by something else. Understanding, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. She cares about you, I said. She's trying to be a good friend based on what you told her. But now I've put her in this weird position where she thinks she needs to protect me from my own mother, Emma said miserably. And I've put you in a position where one of my friends thinks you're this awful person who abandoned her family. Margaret looked up from where she'd been staring at her own silent phone. It's like we create these stories about ourselves and other people, and then we get trapped in them. What do you mean? David asked. I mean, I created this story that I'm the person everyone comes to with their problems. So now, Sarah thinks I don't have problems of my own, and my friends think I'm always available, and I've gotten so used to being needed that I don't know who I am if I'm not fixing something for someone. Margaret's voice had gotten quieter as she spoke, and I realized this might be the first time I'd ever heard her acknowledge that her helping might not always be purely altruistic. And I created a story that I had to be strong enough to handle everything alone, I said. So Emma learned that big feelings were something to manage privately, and David learned that his job was to keep everything running smoothly, and nobody learned how to just be messy and human together. Emma's phone buzzed again. This time she turned it face down on the couch without looking at it. I created a story that you abandoned us, Emma said quietly. And then I had to keep finding evidence for it, even when it didn't really fit what was actually happening. David was nodding slowly. And I created a story that if I just stayed calm and reasonable, everyone else's big emotions wouldn't affect me as much. But that just made me kind of useless when people actually needed me to show up emotionally. The room fell quiet, except for the soft sound of Emma's phone vibrating against the couch cushion. None of us moved to answer it. The thing is, I said after a moment, these stories worked for a while. They got us through a really hard time, but now they're getting in the way. So how do we write different stories? Emma asked. Before anyone could answer, the doorbell rang. We all froze, looking at each other. That's probably Jessica, Emma said, her face going pale. I never responded to her texts. Through the front window, I could see a figure on our porch, and my stomach dropped as I realized this was about to become much more complicated than a family conversation about communication patterns. Emma looked at me with panic in her eyes. She's going to expect me to still be angry at you, and she's going to be weird and protective, and I don't know how to handle this. The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. The doorbell's third ring seemed to echo through the living room, and I watched Emma's face cycle through a dozen different emotions in the span of seconds. Her shoulders hunched forward as if she was trying to make herself smaller, and she kept glancing between the front door and the three of us like she was calculating escape routes. Emma, I said gently, you don't have to pretend to be someone you're not, even for your friends. But I've been telling Jessica all these things about you for months, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. I made such a big deal about how you left us, and how I couldn't forgive you. And now she's going to think I'm weak or fake if I'm just sitting here having a normal conversation with you. Margaret shifted forward on the couch, her therapist instincts clearly kicking in. What if Jessica's reaction says more about what kind of friend she is than what kind of person you are? That's easy for you to say. Emma shot back, but without her earlier venom. You don't have to go to school with her every day. David had been quietly watching the front window, and now he turned back to us. She's still out there, just standing on the porch. Emma's phone buzzed again against the couch cushion, and this time the vibration seemed louder in the tense silence. I could see Emma's hands shaking slightly where they rested on her knees. The thing is, I said carefully, part of rewriting our stories means being willing to let other people be surprised by us, even disappointed in us sometimes. Emma looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. You mean like how you were willing to let us be disappointed when you moved out, because staying was making everything worse? The insight hit me like a physical blow, both because it was accurate and because I hadn't expected Emma to understand that level of complexity in what had happened between us. Yes, I said. Exactly like that. The doorbell rang a fourth time, and now we could hear Jessica's voice calling through the door. Emma, I can see your car in the driveway. Are you okay? Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath that reminded me so much of the little girl she'd been. The one who used to stand at the top of the high dive at the community pool, gathering courage. I need to talk to her, Emma said finally. But I don't know how to explain this without making it sound like I was lying before. Were you lying before? Margaret asked gently. Emma considered this for a long moment. Not lying exactly. More like telling the most dramatic version of the truth because that felt more real than the complicated version. David nodded slowly. The complicated version is messier. It's harder to explain. And it's harder to stay angry when you acknowledge the complicated parts, I added. Emma stood up from the couch, smoothing down her shirt in a gesture that was pure, nervous energy. Okay, I'm going to answer the door, but I don't want her to come in right now. This conversation isn't finished, and I don't want to have to perform for an audience. I felt something loosen in my chest at her words. The idea that our conversation wasn't finished, that there was more to work through together, felt like a gift I hadn't expected. We'll be right here, I said. Emma walked to the front door with the careful, measured steps of someone approaching something they'd rather avoid. Through the living room's open archway, we could hear her open the door and step outside onto the porch, pulling it mostly closed behind her. Her voice was muffled but audible through the walls. Hey, Jess, sorry I didn't answer your texts. Jessica's response was harder to make out, but her tone had that sharp quality of someone who'd worked themselves into worry and irritation. Margaret, David, and I sat in awkward silence, trying to pretend we weren't listening while being completely unable to stop ourselves from straining to hear Emma's half of the conversation. No, I'm okay, Emma was saying. Actually, I'm more than okay. I'm figuring some things out. A pause, then Emma's voice again, firmer this time. I know that's not what you expected to hear, but things aren't always as simple as they seem. David caught my eye and raised his eyebrows in a look of impressed surprise. Margaret was nodding slightly, as if Emma was confirming something she'd hoped might be true. The conversation on the porch continued for several more minutes, with Emma's voice growing more confident as it went on. I couldn't make out most of Jessica's responses, but I could tell from the rhythm of the exchange that Emma was holding her ground about something. Finally, we heard Jessica's footsteps heading back down the porch steps, and Emma came back inside, closing the front door firmly behind her. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were bright with what looked like equal parts exhaustion and exhilaration. How did that go? I asked. Emma sank back down onto the couch, pulling her legs up under her. Weird, really weird. She kept waiting for me to say something about how awful you are, and when I wouldn't do it, she got kind of pushy about it. Pushy how? Margaret asked. Like she was disappointed that I wasn't more dramatic about the whole thing. Like my family problems were supposed to be entertainment for her or something. Emma shook her head. I never noticed that before. David leaned back in his chair. Sometimes when we change, we notice things about our relationships that were always there, but we couldn't see them. Is that what happened with you and Mom? Emma asked David directly. When she moved out, did you notice things that had always been there? David glanced at me, and I saw something pass between us that felt like permission to be honest. Yeah, David said. I noticed that I'd gotten so used to your mom managing everyone's emotions that I'd stopped managing my own. And I noticed that we'd both gotten so focused on taking care of everyone else that we'd forgotten how to take care of each other. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this. I think I noticed that I'd gotten so used to being angry that I forgot what I was actually angry about, she said finally. The late afternoon light was starting to fade outside, casting longer shadows across the living room floor. I realized we'd been sitting here talking for hours, and for the first time in months, nobody seemed to be in a hurry to be somewhere else. So, what happens now? Emma asked. With us, I mean. Do you come back home? Do we just pretend none of this happened? I looked around at the 3 people who meant more to me than anyone else in the world, all of them waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I had. I think, I said slowly, we figure out how to be a family that doesn't pretend things are simple when they're not, and doesn't pretend we're fine when we're not, and doesn't expect any one person to fix everything for everyone else. That sounds really hard, Emma said. Probably, Margaret agreed, but maybe not as hard as what we've been doing. David stretched his arms above his head, joints popping audibly. So we're really doing this? We're rewriting our stories? Emma picked up her phone from where it had been buzzing periodically throughout our conversation and deliberately turned it off completely. I'm willing to try, she said.